I'll never forget the first time I saw Joe. He wasn't even at our zoo yet. In fact, no one was even sure if he'd survive the trip to us. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you're going to understand Joe, the real Joe, you need to know where he came from, what he endured, and how he climbed not just a wall, but out of a life no animal should have to endure. I work at the Northside Wildlife Sanctuary in Illinois. It's not the biggest zoo, but it's one of the most respected for primate rehabilitation. I've been volunteering here since I retired 6 years ago, mostly working with the primate team. I'm not a zookeeper, not a vet. I just clean, carry, observe, and, mostly, listen. That's how I got Joe's story. The first I heard of him was through a late phone call the sanctuary director, Monica, got one Tuesday evening. It was from someone in the state wildlife department who had been part of a raid on an illegal roadside zoo in southern Missouri. One of those off-the-highway, wildlife experiences, with rusted fences, faded animal posters, and no licenses. You've probably seen them once or twice on road trips and never given them a second thought. Most people don't. That zoo had everything it shouldn't. Tigers in 20 by 20 enclosures, bears kept in rusted steel cages on concrete floors, parrots with clipped wings and broken feathers. But the worst of it, what even hardened animal control officers were still talking about, was the chimpanzee. They found Joe chained to a metal stake in the ground, like a dog. He was sitting in a corner of a tiny pen no bigger than a small bedroom, surrounded by his own waste, scraps of food, and twisted metal toys that hadn't been touched in years. There was a chain around his ankle, long enough that he could move about 6 feet in any direction but not reach the edge of the fence. He had no bedding, no stimulation, no companionship. No light except what filtered through the holes in a tarp stretched over the top of the enclosure. No one knew how long he'd been there, but from the looks of his teeth, fur, and feet, some guessed more than 15 years. His name was scribbled on a small, weather-worn tag nailed into the wooden post of his pen: Joe. No last name, just Joe, as if that would make up for the years he'd spent wasting away in silence. Joe was about 27 years old when they found him, middle-aged for a chimpanzee. No birth records, no medical files, no documentation. The owner of the illegal zoo claimed Joe had been a rescue himself, though no one believed that. More likely, he'd been purchased as a juvenile decades earlier, possibly from someone breeding chimps illegally, which was more common in the 80s and 90s. Joe didn't look anyone in the eye when they first approached his pen. When one of the officers stepped too close, Joe bared his teeth, not a grin, but a grimace, a warning. He dragged his chain away and tried to hide behind a dented trash can someone had thrown into the enclosure as enrichment. It still had a sticker from a car wash on it. What the authorities didn't know, though, was that Joe had been watching. And waiting. The roadside zoo had been under surveillance for months before the raid. Officers had driven by at odd hours, flown drones overhead, even sent in a young man undercover as a maintenance worker. That man, his name was Sam, had noticed something peculiar about Joe. Every morning, Joe climbed the same corner of his enclosure. He tested the chain link there, poked at the rusted crossbars with a stick he'd sharpened on the concrete floor. He never let the staff see him do it, only the raccoons and the possums that slinked by in the early morning hours. It was clear, Sam said later, that Joe wasn't just existing, he was planning. What happened next didn't make the papers. It didn't go viral, and it didn't make Joe a celebrity. But in our world, it changed everything. The day before the scheduled raid, a storm passed through the region. Tornado watches had been issued, and by evening, winds were gusting at 60 miles per hour. At that illegal zoo, animals had no shelter. Tarp roofs flapped violently. A section of fencing came loose from Joe's pen, just enough. That night, Joe made his move. He must have braced his back legs on the corner post and used both arms to yank free the weakest part of the wall. No one saw him go. In the early hours of the morning, Joe broke the ankle chain, likely with a chunk of steel from the fallen fencing, and disappeared into the forest behind the roadside zoo. By the time the raid began at 9 a.m., his pen was empty. It took 4 days to find him. Helicopters with infrared cameras scanned the wooded area. Search teams moved through the thick underbrush. Wildlife traps were set. People feared the worst. that Joe, after decades of captivity and poor health, had succumbed to exposure or starvation. Or worse, that someone had shot him, mistaking him for a threat. But on the fourth day, a local farmer just outside of Ava, Missouri, called in to report a strange monkey he'd seen rummaging through his shed. When officers arrived, Joe was crouched silently behind a stack of firewood. He didn't run. He didn't lash out. He just sat there, watching. Waiting. His eyes locked on the officer's tranquilizer gun, but he didn't move. When the dart hit, he flinched, then folded over gently like a man bowing to an audience. When they brought Joe to our facility 3 days later, he was thin, dehydrated, and silent. His fur was matted with dirt, and he had several open sores on his legs and feet from the chain and the escape. The sanctuary director herself oversaw his intake. "He'll need time," she said softly. "A lot of time." I watched from a distance as they wheeled Joe into quarantine. He was still under sedation. Even unconscious, his face looked tired, like someone who had seen far more than he should have, but had made it through sheer will. A survivor. That was the beginning of Joe's new life. But don't let yourself think it was some Hollywood redemption story. Recovery for chimps isn't quick, and trust isn't easy. Joe had been failed by humans for nearly 3 decades. It would take more than fresh fruit and a big enclosure to bring him back to life. I didn't meet Joe face to face until 4 months later. But even from outside the glass, even before he would let anyone come near him, we could tell there was something behind those eyes. Something unbroken. Joe wasn't just alive. He was watching, and waiting again, but this time, for something better. By the time I finally met Joe in person, I had been volunteering at Northside Wildlife Sanctuary for nearly 5 years. I'd worked with macaques, capuchins, and even a silverback gorilla who had been rescued from a bankrupt circus. But there was something different about Joe, something all of us could sense, even those who'd spent their careers with primates. When he first arrived, Joe was placed in our primate quarantine wing, a secure but quiet space in the back of the sanctuary's veterinary complex. Every new primate goes through a minimum 90-day quarantine, not just for medical clearance, but because emotional stabilization is just as important. With Joe, we had no idea what kind of exposure he'd had: viruses, parasites, bacterial infections. His diet at the illegal zoo had consisted mainly of canned beans, marshmallows, and the occasional banana if the owner had bothered to bring them. His teeth were in poor shape. His left molars were cracked, probably from chewing on metal or trying to break his own chain. The soles of his feet were calloused and hardened from decades without natural ground cover. His nails were overgrown. His right arm had a permanent muscle imbalance, likely from being restrained on that side more than the other. But more than any of that, what concerned the veterinary staff most was his mental condition. Joe didn't vocalize. He didn't make the pant hoots that most adult chimpanzees do when greeting or calling. He didn't clap, drum, or use sticks. He didn't make eye contact with staff. He didn't respond to the presence of other chimpanzees, even when they were housed in adjacent enclosures and vocalizing to him. He didn't even react to mirrors, a typical test for self-recognition in chimps. He simply sat, not in a corner, not cowering, just sitting upright in the middle of his enclosure, like he was waiting for someone to make the first move. My first real shift near Joe was in the 5th week of his quarantine. I wasn't assigned to clean his enclosure, just to help prep enrichment items and organize storage. I was wiping down a tray of puzzle feeders when I glanced through the glass partition that looked into his room. Joe was facing the wall, his back to the observation window. I remember I paused, just for a second, and whispered, "Hey, Joe." He didn't turn, didn't flinch. But 20 seconds later, without ever looking, he reached behind him and gently tapped the wall once. Just once, like a code. Then he went still again. We all noticed moments like that. Tiny signals that Joe was aware of us, of the new environment, of the difference between here and there. But he was cautious. And who could blame him? Every human he'd ever known had used him, neglected him, or watched him suffer in silence. Why should he expect this place to be any different? The breakthrough didn't come from us. It came from Maggie. Maggie was a 35-year-old female chimpanzee, one of our longest residents. She had been rescued as a youngster from a now-defunct lab where she'd been used for hepatitis vaccine trials. Despite her background, Maggie had one of the gentlest temperaments of any chimp in our care. She was strong, sure, but she was a caretaker. When a new chimp was introduced into the sanctuary's larger habitat, Maggie was often the first one we brought to meet them. In Joe's case, the team decided to begin with limited proximity, side-by-side caging with a solid divider and small view windows. It allowed them to smell and hear one another without risk. The first time Maggie was wheeled into the adjoining enclosure, she let out 3 short vocalizations, followed by a low, rhythmic pant. Joe didn't respond. He didn't even move. But that night, the cameras caught him sitting by the divider, watching Maggie as she slept. Over the next few days, we began to see something none of us had expected so soon. Joe started to mimic her. Subtly at first. He would shift when she shifted. If she sat near the food tray, he would do the same on his side. When Maggie played with a ball of newspaper stuffed with grapes, Joe batted his own, gently, just once, as if unsure it was allowed. By the 8th week, Maggie began leaving her own food uneaten, pushing it through the small access opening toward Joe's side. He never took it, but he would sit beside it, like he understood what it meant. That gesture of kindness, of sharing, was the moment Joe started to come back. The real turning point came on day 63. It was late morning. I remember because I'd just finished restocking the walk-in fridge and was heading toward the break room. As I passed the quarantine wing, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Drumming. Low, rhythmic, deliberate. Not loud, but unmistakable. I froze. Inside his room, Joe was sitting upright, facing the window, slowly beating the flat of his palm against the floor panel. 1 2, 1 2, like a heartbeat, like a message. Maggie, in the adjacent enclosure, sat perfectly still, watching him. Then, slowly, she picked up a stick and tapped it once against the bars of her own cage. For the first time, Joe smiled. Not the baring of teeth we'd seen in distress, but a soft pull of his cheeks, a squint of the eyes. The subtle, unmistakable sign of recognition. When the vet team reviewed the footage later that day, Monica shook her head and whispered, "He's choosing to come back." Within 2 weeks, we began preparations for Joe's transition into the main chimpanzee habitat. That wasn't something we took lightly. Chimp introductions are some of the riskiest in animal management. They are intelligent, emotional, and powerful animals with complex social dynamics. A poorly timed introduction can lead to serious injuries or permanent social rejection. But Joe surprised us again. His first time stepping into the larger habitat, nearly a half-acre forested area with climbing structures, platforms, and shallow pools, he didn't run or cower. He walked in slowly, looked up at the trees, and placed his palm flat on the ground. Then he looked up, straight into the face of one of the keepers, and let out a low vocalization. A greeting. Maggie was brought in shortly after, and the two met in the center of the habitat. There was tension, of course, posturing, circling, soft hoots. But then Maggie did something bold. She reached out and touched Joe's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He leaned into it. That was the beginning of Joe's reintegration. Over the next several months, Joe became a member of the main group. He wasn't the dominant male, never seemed to want that role, but he was respected. He was slow to warm to new staff, but by the time I got assigned to help prepare his group's habitat enrichment, Joe would often sit at the edge of the mesh and watch me as I set out puzzle boxes, frozen treat logs, or scatter feeds. He especially liked boxes filled with shredded paper and sunflower seeds. He would patiently pick through each piece like a jeweler sorting gems. By month 6, Joe had gained 22 pounds, his coat had filled in, and he began vocalizing regularly. Staff described him as cautious but deliberate. He preferred watching to initiating, but when he did engage, especially with Maggie or another quiet male named Theo, he did so with gentleness. Grooming, resting side by side, even soft play. And me? I was just the guy who cleaned his habitat and talked to him while setting out his lunch. But every now and then, Joe would come sit near where I stood outside the enclosure. He'd lean against the mesh and look at me, not through me, but at me. Like he remembered what it meant to be seen. Remembered that the world could be bigger than 6 feet of chain and silence. Remembered that he'd escaped, yes, but more importantly, that he'd survived. Joe had been with us for a year when I started to realize something strange. I had stopped thinking of him as the chimp who escaped. It sounds small, but it's not. So much of the work we do in rescue, especially at a sanctuary like ours, is shaped by what came before. Trauma, abuse, neglect. It's written in their bodies, their eyes, their silences. Most of the animals who end up here are defined, at least at first, by what they've endured. Joe had certainly been no different. For months, he was the Missouri chimp, the chain one, the escapee. But sometime during that first year, all of that shifted. He became just Joe. And that, to me, is the most remarkable part of his story. His habitat was called Habitat C, but the staff quietly started calling it Joe's Troop. Not because he led it, he never pushed for dominance, but because the group's emotional center, the calm in the storm, the quiet middle, was him. By then, his group included 7 other chimps: Maggie, Theo, Sasha, a boisterous female from an exotic pet case, her younger brother Jax, a retired biomedical male named Roman, and 2 females, Fala and Binti, both from a shuttered zoo in Ohio. Joe wasn't the most vocal or active, but the others gravitated to him. Grooming sessions often began with him. Disputes often ended near him. When it was feeding time, the younger ones waited to see where Joe went before choosing their own spots. He seemed to carry a quiet authority that didn't come from displays or aggression, but from presence. From having been through it. Joe never sought out the company of humans the way some chimps do. He didn't hoot when new guests arrived or gesture for attention. He wasn't withdrawn, but he didn't perform. What he did do was watch. And remember. One of the keepers, Lydia, who had worked with chimps for 2 decades, told me something I never forgot. She said, "He listens with his whole body. Like someone who never got to speak." We kept records of everything: feeding times, enrichment participation, social dynamics, medical notes. By month 18, Joe's file read like a slow-building novel. The early entries were filled with caution: declined to approach, showed avoidance, did not respond to enrichment. Then came: observed grooming Maggie for 2+ minutes, interacted with puzzle feeder, no signs of aggression during introduction. Then, initiated contact, play vocalization with Sasha, led group to upper platform. Those weren't just checkboxes, they were milestones. I remember one especially cold day in early February, just after a snowstorm. The habitat doors were closed, and we'd brought the chimps inside to their heated winter spaces. Staff had packed large paper boxes with snow and hidden raisins, nuts, and cranberries inside, just one of the many ways we try to keep the environment stimulating. When Joe's group was led into the indoor habitat, the others ran straight for the snow boxes. Joe didn't. He stood near the window and watched the snowfall. Just stood there, both hands against the glass, staring out at the trees, the snowflakes landing one by one on the mesh. A few minutes later, he walked to the enrichment box, scooped a small handful of snow, and gently pressed it against his chest before licking it. We don't know what that meant. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. 2 years in, Joe had developed a preference for certain keepers. Lydia was one, so was Tim, our senior vet tech. He didn't interact with me often, but I had earned a place in the background. A safe presence. There was one day, I'll never forget it, when Joe approached the mesh near where I was standing during feeding prep. I wasn't even looking directly at him, just counting out vitamin biscuits. Then I heard a soft tap against the mesh. I looked up. Joe was sitting with his back against the barrier, one arm draped over his knee. Calm, unmoving. He looked at me for a few seconds, then made a sound I hadn't heard from him before, a low, 2-tone vocalization. Not a demand, not a complaint, just a call. Then he got up and walked away. I don't pretend to know what that meant. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. By his 3rd year, Joe had become a model for rehabilitated chimpanzees. We were invited to contribute data to several studies on social reintegration. His name was referenced in lectures and presentations, not as a research subject, but as a success story. A survivor not only of physical captivity, but of emotional isolation. One visiting primatologist, after observing Joe's group for a week, said, "This chimpanzee has a leadership style I've only seen a handful of times in 30 years. He doesn't dominate, he stabilizes." And that was exactly it. He was the center, the weight, the steady anchor of a group that had never known peace. In time, Joe began using tools. Not elaborate ones, but enough to demonstrate the cognitive flexibility he'd always had. He would dip sticks into holes to retrieve yogurt, use leaves as napkins, even gather small objects to create a perch for Jax, the younger male who idolized him. But more than anything, Joe had learned how to exist with others, without fear, without chains, without a need to protect every inch of ground. He'd made a life. The last time I saw Joe up close was on a late summer evening. We were closing down the grounds after a long day, and I paused by the upper overlook of Habitat C. The chimps were settling in for the night. The air was soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything feel like a memory even as it's happening. Joe was lying on a platform, his hands behind his head, legs stretched out like he was floating. Maggie lay beside him. Theo was grooming Binti a few feet away. The others were scattered, resting. Joe turned his head and looked directly up at me. For a long moment we just looked at each other. And I thought, not about how he'd escaped, or the horrors he endured, or the chain around his ankle. I thought about where he was now. And I knew, Joe didn't belong to that past anymore. He had a past, yes. But it no longer defined him. He had climbed the wall. He had chosen to live. And in doing so, he had shown all of us what survival really means. Not just getting out, but letting yourself come back.